Welcome, everybody, to this week's AIOps Evolution Weekly. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill. Bill, how you doing this week?
Doing well,
Good.
Sean.
Do you have a good week?
Yeah, it's been a good week. Though it's
I
as always busy, but really good.
I ask you that every week, and you always go,
Yeah.
"Yep." So I'm not going to ask you that anymore. I'm just going to say welcome. So welcome, everybody. So this week we're going to be talking about a few subjects here. So the first one we're going to talk about is digital twinning. The second we're going to talk about is employee experience, and obviously both of these are related to AI and AI ops. And the last one we're going to talk about is buying considerations around AI. So let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about digital twin. So, recent article by Kyle Kyle Wiggers, and I thought this is really an article about Google's new release of their digital twin supply chain twin offering. And it's not really, it in itself isn't related to AI ops. But what I found really interesting is using some of what Google's doing in their cloud-based offerings of being able to replicate physical supply chains in kind of a virtual digital world.
Mhm.
Is this something, and then using AI, right, to start understanding supply chain patterns and things like that? Is this something that we can start using in the operations world, IT operations, of basically building replicate environments and starting to use those environments to do scenario testing and things like that?
Mhm.
So, Bill, did you get a chance to read this article?
Yeah, I did, and I actually found it really interesting myself because it was reminding me back to the late '90s. There was a product, a company called Mill3, and they
Mm-hmm.
became OpNet, and then they got acquired by Riverbed not long ago. So they're still around, and it's around network simulation software. And I remember visiting and getting trained when I worked in an operations center and using them because you don't want to experiment and try things, new traffic, new, building up new centers, without experimenting or testing that or simulating in an offline way instead of sort of let's see what it looks like it's going to do on the network. And so I think the purpose here is I think that in a network is a pretty manageable space, but you might have thousands of routers and switches, and simulating that gets pretty complex. But it's still something you want to do at least in segmented areas to see how new services are going to play over the network. In the supply chain world, it just puts networks a little bit, is much more of a larger scale. And so I think, billions of dollars going through, and we've got, ports being, being blocked and blockaded, or not blockaded, but, backed up
Mm-hmm.
in Los Angeles and everywhere else. I think this supply chain is very relevant in how to replicate that. Basically, how do you replicate the supply chain with everything going on in a simulated way? And some of the bigger players, Google's one, it references what Microsoft is doing with a very similar Azure Digital Twin. That this is really becoming kind of the next, what I think McKinsey calls it Industry 4.0. And so, really having a simulated real world of business operations, supply chain, manufacturing being kind of one of the biggest areas that affects all of us. I thought it was fascinating, kind of what they're trying to do here. So.
Yeah, I haven't followed UpNet in a while, and but you're right. I mean, we spent a lot of time back in the day of operations using OpNet for,
Mm-hmm.
and there were other tools that actually, OpNet allowed us to do modeling and simulation of
Yeah,
traffic patterns and things like
yep,
that.
that's right.
And then there were other tools out there that would actually simulate a large scale network. So if we were building a monitoring system and we wanted to scale it against, say, 10,000 nodes, we could
Mm-hmm.
actually replicate that using this software. And I can't remember exactly what it was.
Was it
I,
Mimic, or is that
yeah, I think that was one
something
of
like
them,
that?
but I don't.
GNS3 is one
That's
used I see a lot today.
that's not the one I was thinking of. But yeah,
Okay.
Mimic was one of the big ones.
Yeah.
But this digital twinning, I think, is uh, the reason why I thought it was interesting in relative terms of what we're doing is the ability for us to start using AI in really kind of replicating the IT environment, but the IT environment is essentially already digitized, right? So you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about
Yeah.
in this article, it's really talking about taking physical things, like you said,
Yeah.
factories, supply chains, raw materials, and being able to piece that all together. I find it very interesting, just personally, like how they're actually going to collect this data and how they're going to actually be able to replicate, raw material creation all the way through factories around the world and transportation, where they're going to get that data to figure out how to replicate it.
Yeah.
But in the IT world, being able to say, hey, how do we can we build essentially a digital twin that will allow us to roll applications and things like that? And there's technologies out there, but
Yep.
bringing AI into the conversation around how to analyze the performance of these applications and the loads and things like that, and even using AI to use historical data to create simulations can be a really powerful thing in the IT business. So again, thought that was just kind of an interesting article,
Yeah.
kind of a little bit unrelated to AI ops, but that's what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to not only just give you AI ops news, but also look around the AI industry in general and say, are there things going on in AI in general that we should be thinking about in the AI ops arena?
Right.
So,
Yep.
all right. So moving on, let's talk about. You wanted to bring up an article about employee experience using AI and employee
Yeah.
experience.
I thought it was interesting. It left me a little bit wanting more, and I didn't get a chance to drill deeper into it. Looking at specific software, just kind of did a little bit of some investigation. But it was called "How AI Can Help You Drive Your Employee Experience Strategy." So it's it was an article in Forbes. They really just covered sort of introducing in the first half of the article is the problems with lower employee engagement, that slows down momentum and productivity. We all know there's a worker shortage now, and burnout, and kind of what's it called, the great resignation. Somebody said that to me recently. And so, there were really two solutions that were very broad. One was employee time tracking. People spend so much time across all these different systems, and how can AI help track kind of what people are really doing and be more effective that way? And then the other one was about decision making and putting in place self-driving AI. But they didn't really go into specific examples or specific tools or products that are out there. But I don't know if you've come across any of these initiatives, Sean, or had any thoughts on sort of how AI is really going to help the overall employee experience.
Yeah, I actually found this article kind of interesting too. So when you sent it over, I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. Yeah, and basically, like you said, some statistics on employee productivity drops and stuff like that, which
Yeah.
kind of makes sense with the pandemic. And it had a kind of a special meaning to me because having built and run a consulting company for the last 25 years,
Yeah.
and been in consulting years before that, timesheets is like like the center of my universe. And
Right.
it really is. I mean, it drives in a time-based company, like a services company, like a lawyer or a consultant, stuff like that. It drives everything, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I have learned over the last 25 years that there's some people who just aren't very good at it, and that's really problematic when you're trying to run a business.
Right.
So I felt the same way. I felt like this article was kind of a wish list, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
I wanted more out of it. But and the idea of like they kind of spent half the article talking about self-driving, which was kind of an interesting concept. I'm wanting more of like, what does that mean? But it
Right.
got me thinking, right? It got me thinking about you know how can AI be used, and this is really important in IT. And the reason why I thought this article really resonated with me, because when you talk about employee burnout, I mean, IT is really well known for employee burnout. And I tell you, one of the things that I hear from a lot of my peers and other people I've talked to is that working from home is great, but there is it's a much more challenge to work-life balance, and they feel like they're
Mm-hmm.
working more because they don't have an on-off switch. It's more like a dimmer switch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's contributed to the fact that over the last 18 months, we haven't been going out as much. So we've been working more, a little less work balance. You're now at home, new environment. You're trying to get work done during the day. You're getting work done at night, and it's all kind of blurring together. Where
Mm-hmm.
sometimes if you work in office, you can just kind of leave and just not think about it.
Yeah.
So this is a real problem, I think, in the IT world, right? In IT business. And the ability for AI to start looking into different systems and gathering, like, hey, let me look at my Google Calendar. Let me look at things that I've been doing on my computer, type of work I've been doing. I've been writing a Word document to be able to compile time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
would be really, 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 really interesting to do. I haven't heard of anybody doing it, and certainly the company that we use for time tracking has never, they haven't brought that out. And I could see some, some issues with it. I mean, you could read your calendar and you can say, okay, you had a
Yeah.
meeting today, and but how do they know what client it was for? I guess you could look at the attendees and see, okay, on that. So it can also get kind of invasive of,
Yeah.
digging into people's computers and calendars, and that probably could make people very uneasy. So there's probably a fair amount of ethical conversation about this,
Yep.
as well as, whether people would really want that and just
Yeah.
say, hey, I'd rather just report my time manually. But I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting, and I think that it's, the core of the article, I thought, really was not necessarily, they talked a lot about time tracking and AI using that, but I think the bigger message of this was, in the IT world where burnout is a problem, how can we better understand what people are working on so we can better balance their lives
Mm-hmm.
and create more work life balance. And
Yep.
as a CEO, I think about that all the time,
Yeah.
right? Because we want to make sure that we are responding to the needs of our employees and what they need to do to be happy,
Yeah.
right? Because if
Yeah.
they're not happy at work. I mean, if they're not happy at home, they're not happy at work.
Right. I mean, I think of two areas. One is calendaring apps and productivity apps, because we all have, there's your to-do list that you plan, there's your calendar, the scheduled things, there's the unplanned events that come up. And I think we've all sort of been through with the Franklin Covey planner and all these apps to dos and the Palm Pilot. And there's been so many iterations of how do you manage your time? How do you manage your tasks? How do you handle incoming things and plan for the unexpected? And how do you make sure it's the highest priority that you're working on? I think there's lots of room where AI can kind of help suggest things, but I think that there's a lot of efforts towards that. But I think that we're still a long way from finding nirvana in helping employees be completely productive.
Yeah, well, I mean, personal productivity is a ginormous market, right? I mean,
Yep.
just think of the billions of dollars on health books and blogs and
Yeah.
people. And I'm kind of a junkie when it comes to that stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot about the personal productivity space.
Yeah.
And there are apps out there like personal calendaring systems that are trying to basically say, hey, we can track your time. But then that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
flow into the enterprise, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
flow
Right.
into anywhere else. It's more like, how am I personally being more productive? But as your IT leader looking across 1,000 people, who's overworked, who's underworked, who's using their time wisely, how are we tracking against
Mm-hmm.
projects, how we project, is allocated time to projects accurate, the right for successful deployment of projects. That's a much harder thing, and maybe AI
Yep.
can play into that. But I think that's going
Yep.
to probably come from companies like Microsoft and things like that.
Yep. Exactly.
So great. That was good. That was a fun conversation.
Yeah.
Um,
More. We got into it more than I thought we might. That's good.
yeah. People are like, you found that fun? Okay. Um, all right. So last thing we want to talk about, and this is, I'm actually kind of excited about this article. So this is an article called 8 Considerations for Buying versus Building AI. And I thought this was just a great article,
Mm-hmm.
kind of talking about what this is all about and what you should be thinking about when it comes to making AI investments, and should you build it your own? And if you build it your own, do you go open source? If you don't build it your own and go with vendors, what's the pros and the cons? And I thought this was really great, and really kind of lays out the foundation of, um, what are some of the issues of either side. So, like, if you decided to use a vendor technology, do you deal with vendor lock-in?
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to build your own, is there a cost of staffing? Do you have a niche type need? And if so, is there a vendor out there that can support that, or do you need to build something more um, customized to yourself? Do you need to be able to, is what you're building from an AI perspective more kind of common thing? So maybe like around like an AIOps use case of monitoring large scale data sets, or is it something nichey that is a differentiator that could differentiate your company in the marketplace? So there's all these kind of factors that you can think about, and it'd be kind of interesting if you could actually build and I think I'll work on this. You, Bill, this is you and I. We're going to work on this, like a flow chart, like this tree of whether you should build your own or whether you should, use a vendor, and you just kind of go through this flow chart and say, okay, in the end, we're going to go this route, and this is why based on this thing. But
Mhm.
did you get a chance to review this art? I mean, a lot of this data is coming out of
Mhm.
Gartner.
Yep.
So, um, did you get a
Yeah, no,
chance to review this article?
yeah, I did. And no, I thought it was a good kind of framework for evaluating whether, you buy versus build. And I think just our last two examples of employee experience and supply chain just kind of demonstrates the breadth that AI applies to. And so there was actually a link in this article that talked about other tools. And as you went through those, there's AI tools about bots and virtual agents and about visual processing. And I mean, it's just the huge range of AI applications. Pretty much any application that's an IT application is AI kind of becoming embedded in it. And so it's a question of, do you go down the path of choosing a product that's really has leading AI capabilities, or do you start building, or do you have a use case that is you got to custom build it because it isn't something that exists already. And so I think two of the things that I took away as far as factors, one was sort of integration with existing software. I think there's a lot of APIs and API management and being open is kind
Mm-hmm.
of we're seeing that's becoming a lot more standard, but it's still a challenge. And so a lot of AI, these applications have direct integrations, and you go in and they might list hundreds of application integrations, or maybe they just list a few. And so you got to look at your space and say, are the products that I'm looking at, is there a well developed sort of integration ecosystem that the vendors have? If so, building it yourself may not make sense. But if you're breaking new ground, you may want to go down the path of building it yourself. And then the other one was just the complexity of the problem. And that kind of goes into the same thing as, do you really have the skill set and the talent that are really going to be able to get into the deeper algorithms and that really understand the data and the science behind visual processing, or is that something that's developing kind of a commercial off the shelf market? So yeah, a lot of good considerations as you kind of look at which way to go. But I think there's probably some answer in the middle. I think it's good to have a general R&D team that sort of is staying up with TensorFlow and the Python and the scikit libraries that are out there. But I think most of where you're going to solve your AI problems are probably going to eventually become supported software, because I think it's just going to become table stakes for vendors in all these areas to bring AI and machine learning kind of part of the package.
Yeah, I agree. I think as with any system, right? The deployment is one thing, the ongoing maintenance is another, and
Yeah.
AI is even more requires even more maintenance because you are constantly tweaking models and looking at behavioral changes and things like that.
Mm,
But yeah, when you talk about these 8 areas, right? The areas that you talk about is availability, talent, right? So if you don't
yeah.
have availability of talent, you can't get the right people or you can't afford them, then it's going to be very hard to kind of roll your own. You talk about time frame, right? If you're looking for something immediate, yeah, again, back to talent,
Hmm.
then you might have to go with a vendor if it's more immediate because you just don't have the time to kind of build your own. You talked about integrating existing software, vendor lock-in. I mean, that's a big I mean, that's a big consideration because the more you start building, just the deeper that lock-in gets, and it's going to be hard to
Hmm.
move off of it. This all leads into kind of a total cost of ownership.
Yep.
They talk about the complexity of the problem. They talk about regulatory considerations. I thought that was an interesting thing, right? Because
Yeah.
there are a number of regulatory concerns, especially in the healthcare industry, that may require that you maintain systems on-prem. So if you do that, you kind of eliminate all the vendors that are SaaS products that could do the AI work for you. So you might have to
Hmm.
build in-house to do that.
Yep.
And then cloud versus related to that, the last factor that he said is cloud versus on-prem. So it was just a very good discussion about the different aspects of this. And one area that they didn't cover that I thought would have been good to cover is just security, because
Hmm.
again, you're dealing with a lot of data, and that's really the key thing about AI, right? AI, it's all
Yeah.
about the data. You got to put a lot of data into this for training and things like that. And I'm a little surprised that they didn't put the security in there because there are aspects of that, especially in regulatory areas. or utilities and things like that. That
Yeah.
do you really want
Private
to be?
information.
Yeah, do you really want to be putting mass amounts of data sets into the cloud? And if you do, are you dealing with vendors that are protecting that data, and are they like SOC 2 compliant and all these other factors that need to go into it? Versus if you build it your own, you've got your own security compliances and controls that you need to cover, and are you prepared to cover those types of controls? And if you're going to, and the harder scenario is if you're saying we're going to roll our own, but we're going to run it on AWS, right? Then you're actually putting it in the cloud and building your own, and you're getting some protection from AWS, but then there's a fair amount of application system-based controls that aren't being met. So that's a big factor that I think they should have covered. So this should have been 9 areas of AI, 9 considerations, but I'll let them do that next time. So, but I thought this was a really good article, and like I said, it's a very logical approach to how you should be thinking about building these things out, and whether you roll your own or not. And I don't think there's any wrong answer. And I think ultimately organizations are going to be doing a hybrid, right? Because if you look at your overall AI strategy, right? And let's say your overall AIOps strategy, if you go kind of one level down, you may be looking at it and saying, hey, there are certain aspects of our business and our applications and how we do this that we want to build an AI component. But then at the same time, we're going to go procure an AIOps platform that would process events and look at, root cause analysis and correlation using AI. So you may end up doing both, and that's perfectly acceptable too. So it really kind of comes down to what is your overall vision and your strategy, and making the decision on every single use case, because there really is no reason to go out and say, I'm going to roll my own to cover a use case that every single company in the United States is dealing with, right? There's vendors out there that can do it better, faster, more securely than you can.
Yep. Well, I also think there's products out there that are coming that provide a development kit, right? So you get the COTS product and you can kind of get what's out of the box, but then you can kind of get the development kit that is using all these same open source products, right? And then there's also open source products that are becoming kind of commercialized, where like the Elk Stack is an example, where there's free Elastic, but there's other algorithms and machine learning on top of that. And so I think it's probably always going to be a mix, where if you're buying a commercial product, you want to make sure, how can I extend it? How is it extensible? Or if you're looking at open source, is there an option where you can get sort of a supported version of that with some other proprietary maybe algorithms or things you can buy from the market?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. When you start looking at some of these vendors out there and you dig into it, they're probably using a fair amount of open source libraries themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but they have teams of people that are doing it, right? And again, it comes down. I think one of the biggest things to understand is, what is the use case, right? What are the questions you're trying to answer, and what is the impact and what is the result you're trying to get? And if you start there, then start layering on things like regulatory control, security implications, things like that, it will probably become pretty apparent to you whether you build or buy pretty quickly, right? And again, you may, for one use case, it may be a build, and another one might be a buy, right? And it all comes down to what's the return you're trying to get. So, great. Anything else going on?
Nothing else going on.
Nothing else going on
other than that.
Well, I want to thank our sponsor, Windward Consulting Group. You can check Windward out at www.windward.com. Windward is the leading global provider of AIOps. So you can Google AIOps investment plan or Windward AIOps and find them with all kinds of information about AIOps and all the work and research that they're doing. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in this week. I really appreciate it, and we will see you next week. Take care.
See you next week.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AIOps and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.